On January 6, 1992, author Joe McGinnis was the guest on Later with Bob Costas. He had just finished up his trilogy of true crime novels that got turned into miniseries, Fatal Vision, Blind Faith, and Cruel Doubt. And that's what he was promoting, was Cruel Doubt. And he stated this would probably be his last true crime book. He had started off writing political, real-life books. The Selling of the President about Richard Nixon in 1968 is what catapulted him to fame. And after this, he wrote a book about Teddy Kennedy in 1993. And then he had a weird thing happen. The O.J. Simpson trial, he got $1 million advance. Got a front row seat at the trial. And then he told the publishers, I'm not writing a book about this. This trial was a farce. And gave the money back. So, pretty wild dude. This is a much more entertaining, informative interview than you'd guess off of reading, just true crime novelist. It's not just Costas either. This guy's interesting. Everybody's interesting if you speak to him.
Thanks for staying up later. At the age of 24, Joe McGinnis was a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He had a best-selling book with The Selling of the President in 1968 about the Nixon campaign. At the age of 26, he is the author of Fatal Vision, Blind Faith, and this is his latest, Cruel Doubt, which is published by Simon & Schuster. Joe, briefly lay out the pertinent facts that come into play in Cruel Doubt.
The basic story is actually quite simple, I think. Terrible, but simple. At 4 o'clock in the morning, hot July night, 1988, in a very small town in eastern North Carolina called Little Washington, Bonnie Von Stein, a 44-year-old housewife, mother of two, was awakened as she lay next to her husband in their bedroom by somebody standing over her with a club and a knife trying to kill her. This person or someone in his company did succeed in killing her husband. Her daughter, who had just graduated from high school, her 17-year-old daughter, said then and says to this day that although she was only 20 feet away down the hall, she slept through the whole thing, didn't know a thing. 7 miles away, a hog farmer is putting a load of hogs onto a truck to take them to a slaughterhouse, and he notices a flame flickering in a swamp a quarter-mile up the road. He drives up and takes a look at the flame, wonders who could have lit a fire on that dark country road. Hears the next day that there had been a murder in Little Washington, calls the police. They come to the fire scene and they find a knife, they find articles of burnt clothing, and they find crumpled up off to the side of the fire a map which would show someone how to get from Raleigh, North Carolina, where Chris Pritchard, Bonnie's son, was a student at North Carolina State University, how to get from there to the house where the murder was committed. From that point forward, they began to focus their investigative attentions on Bonnie's son. He was arrested. She did everything she could in his behalf, hiring the best attorneys, legal talent that she could afford, and she inherited $2 million from her husband's death, so she could afford quite a bit. And 5 days before her son was to stand trial, he pleaded not guilty all the way through. 5 days before the trial was to begin, he looked his mother in the eye. He told her the truth. He said, "Mom, I can't go through with this. I've got to tell you, I did this all."
He said that that when we got back to Raleigh, that we should go to an Army surplus store so he could get a machete, so that he could just chop my parents' heads off, so it'd be quick and painless.
What was your reaction to that? Talk about going to get a machete.
I said, "Aren't the Army surplus stores closed?"
And a month after that, after Chris was sentenced to life in prison for his role in this, Bonnie called me up and asked me if I wanted to write a book about it.
And at the heart of it is his obsession with the game Dungeons and Dragons.
Without Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think this particular murder would have taken place. I think that's a very large element here. It's something that cannot be overlooked. That's not to say that everybody who plays Dungeons and Dragons is going to go out and want to commit murder, kill one of their parents. But Chris was so obsessed with this game, so lost in this fantasy world, that he didn't know where reality began and fantasy ended. He has said to me subsequently that only when he got to the hospital and looked down at his mother and saw her lying there with her head bandaged and a tube coming out of her chest, and she was squeezing his hand, tears began pouring down his cheeks, because only then for the first time did he realize this was real. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. This wasn't just a Dungeons and Dragons scenario.
I would have inherited a lot of money. I wouldn't have had to do anything else. I wouldn't have had to go back to school or anything. I could sit around, buy a house, and do drugs all the time. I could play D&D all I wanted to.
But the book is essentially the story of Bonnie, the story of a woman who survives not just the attempt on her life, not just the death of her husband, not just being a suspect, being viewed as a suspect herself for many months, but ultimately the terrible trauma, the worst thing I think any mother could ever have to learn, that her own son wanted to see her dead, wanted so badly to see her dead that he set in motion a plot designed to kill her.
When you enter this project, is your thought, maybe I can shed new light on this in terms of facts? Or is your thought more, I want to explain the motivations, I want to get inside the psychology?
Well, it's really a combination, because when I start work on any story, I know very few of the facts. You know, in this case, Bonnie's lawyer called me up and presented me with a version of some of the facts, which was the version that that as her representative, he would want to have me believe. Mm-hmm. In large part, this turned out to be true, but it was only the beginning of the truth.
And briefly, what did you conclude? Where had it gone wrong? What was the fundamental thing?
The fundamental thing here, I think, Bob, as Chris Pritchard's psychiatrist would say, it happened probably at a very early age, as most fundamental things do. He was abandoned by his natural father when he was 3 years old. Bonnie's first husband walked out, left her with 2 kids to raise by herself, left her with thousands of dollars in debts, and something broke inside him, I think, at that point, that abandonment, that rejection, that never got put back together. But there was a second aspect to it, because a lot of kids get left by their fathers. A lot of kids are abandoned by their fathers, and they don't wind up later on, 20 years later, trying to commit murder or committing murder. I asked Chris, does this go deeper than Dungeons and Dragons? Does it go deeper than the inheritance that you wanted to collect? And he said yes. He said that in his mind, the very deepest level of all of this, in terms of motivation, was his sense that at college, at NC State, he was doing so badly, he was making such a botch of his life, that he was disappointing his mother in a way that he could no longer tolerate. She had done so much for him, and now he was letting her down. And he said to me, if she were dead, I knew I could never disappoint her again.
Did you think about the police?
Yes, sir, I thought about the police. Thought about keeping myself away from them. I didn't want to be arrested, thrown in jail. I didn't want my mom to know.
How sympathetic did you wind up feeling toward him?
I felt more sympathetic, and do feel more sympathetic toward him than I expected to going in. I expected that this would be somebody who would probably be some sort of geek or nerd, or somebody who I would have a very hard time relating to. I wouldn't want to sit here and say that I have developed paternal feelings toward him, but of the 3 people I've written about who have been convicted of committing murders within their own families, he's the only one I'd ever like to have for a house guest at any time. And I do hope, you know, he's only 21 years old. I hope that it is possible for him to get out of prison at some point, receive whatever treatment he might need, and you know, perhaps resume a life that could offer something to other people.
Has this now become, I guess, your specialty? It isn't where you started out, but with Fatal Vision with Jeffrey McDonald, with Blind Faith, the story of the guy from Toms River, New Jersey, who arranged to have his wife killed and tried to make it look like it had been done by some guys trying to rob them. And now this seems to be where where your biggest success is.
Well, it's where I've been for the last, I guess, 12 years, but I don't think it's where I'm going to stay, because it's like I used to be a sports writer, and that was fun and fascinating for a while, and then I wanted to go beyond that. And then I wrote about politics, and that was fascinating, and maybe again. Politics is an ever-changing thing. I got curious about Alaska. I went up there, but I didn't decide to become a nature writer. I have done 3 books that have involved murders within families, but I can't see doing 3 more. I can't see doing 2 more or even 1 more. I think I've really kind of hit the wall in terms of my ability to feel the pain that other people go through when they have to share with me the details of these kinds of stories. There are lots of good stories out there that do not involve people hurting each other. And I think after 12 years, I'm ready and eager to get back to telling some of those.
And we're back now with the author, Joe McGinniss. Safe to say, by a wide margin, despite all your other successes, Fatal Vision is the one, if you retired right now, that would be at the top of your biography, right?
So far, but Cruel Doubt is still very new.
Is there anything that's happened recently that causes you to have any doubt about your conclusion that Jeffrey MacDonald murdered his wife and his 2 daughters?
Absolutely nothing. Nothing whatsoever.
I'm assuming that very many of our viewers know the basic facts of this, but quickly. Jeffrey MacDonald, who seemed like an all-American boy, he was a Princeton graduate. I think he'd gone to med school at Northwestern. He was a Green Beret in the Marines. He's stationed at Fort Bragg. In 1970, his pregnant wife and his 2 young daughters are bludgeoned to death. He claims, and this is shortly after the Manson murders in California, he claims that a band of hippies came into his house, that they chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." The word pig, I think, was scrawled in blood on a headboard or on a wall. He himself had wounds, which he would say proves that he was attacked but survived, that those who don't believe him say that were inflicted using his medical knowledge. But at first, he's arrested but not indicted. They look at the evidence, and at first he goes out as a free man, and his father-in-law champions his defense, believing in him. And then it's not until 1975 that he's indicted, and eventually 79 that he's convicted.
Right. He was finally put on trial for the first and only time in 1979, a trial which I attended. And after only 6.5 hours of deliberation, 9.5 years after the crimes, a jury unanimously found him guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. And for the littlest girl, they found premeditation, the 2-year-old. They found that he had thought it over ahead of time and had decided that he had to kill her as part of his cover-up. And they convicted him, in her case, of a count of first-degree murder.
Now, at first, you didn't think he was guilty.
At first, I didn't know. There's over the years, you know, certain myths spring up around controversial books. For many years, about the selling of the president, people thought that I had somehow worked for the Nixon campaign, that that's how I had gotten my access, was by pretending to be, or actually being, a Nixon staff worker. I mean, that's just not the case. I called them up and asked if I could write a book about them, and they said yes. It's a better story the other way, but it's just not true. Here, I've read over and over and over again that I went into this case believing MacDonald to be innocent, and then later changed my mind and didn't tell him I had changed my mind. I had no mind to change. If you stop and think about it just logically, how could anyone who doesn't know the facts of a case assume guilt or assume innocence prior to a trial? I had met MacDonald only 3 weeks before that trial began in 1979. I had one conversation with him for 3 or 4 hours wherein he laid out his version of events. I wasn't naive or foolish enough to suppose that that was the only version of events. I went to the trial willing, as a juror would be instructed to be, willing to presume innocence in that technical sense. The government was going to have to prove guilt, as they did in the courtroom. But that's a far cry from saying that I had some reason to believe that he was innocent, and then later that belief shifted into one of guilt.
But didn't you walk out of the courtroom believing that the verdict was mistaken?
I walked out with my head spinning, Bob. That was one of the most... That day, the days leading up to that day, and the 6 or 8 months that followed that day were really probably the most confusing of my whole life as a reporter, as a writer. I was so ambivalent. On one hand, I had sat in court every day, had seen the airtight case that they had built against him. They proved beyond any doubt whatsoever that this man had to have committed this crime. Yet, I had spent the summer in the company of this man. He and his friends and lawyers and family had rented a fraternity house on the North Carolina State University campus. I had been with him in the evenings, on the weekends, and I had come to like him. He was a very charming, persuasive, extremely agreeable person. I said, this man, who I think I've come to know, cannot have committed these acts that they've proven that he committed. I was hopelessly confused. I would feel from hour to hour, 1 hour one way, the next hour another way.
So the question becomes, did you let him know about this ambivalence, or did you, as he charges, lead him to believe, without any equivocation, that you believed in his innocence, so he was happy being in league with you to write his book, present his side, and that he wouldn't have to worry about that?
I didn't share with him any ambivalence. I never share with any subject, and I don't think any good writer, any journalist shares with the subject during the process of research the feelings that the writer might have at any particular moment. I don't think that it's professional. I don't think that it's defensible to go out and say to a subject, now, just a minute, you better stop right there, because up until now I had liked you, but when you start to talk that way, I got to tell you, I got to stop you there and tell you that doesn't sound too good. I think we better, you have to be aware now, if you continue in this vein, the piece that I'm going to write about you is going to be one that's going to make you very unhappy. That's not the way a journalist works.
The Janet Malcolm articles in The New Yorker, where she said that essentially all journalists are confidence men or women. They seduce their subjects, they make them feel comfortable, they get them to pour their hearts out, and then they betray them without remorse.
Yeah, she said all journalists know that what they do is morally indefensible. I mean, if she really believes that, then she shouldn't be doing what she's doing. I find it hard to accept that she could really believe that.
Well, there is an irony in her case, which we'll get to in a minute, but I guess that she felt that you were especially guilty. You were guilty, in her view, of unethical behavior. You went beyond that because there were correspondences between you and McDonald which could be taken by a disinterested third party as indicative of support for him, rather than a dispassionate view, I'll be open to your point of view, Jeffrey, I'll listen to it, but indicated support for him. It
was a very complex relationship that I had found myself in, and I wasn't willing until I was absolutely convinced, not just beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond all doubt and for all time, of his guilt. I wasn't willing to turn my back on him, and I have no apologies to make for those letters. I think if anybody looks at the time frame, it's very important, you'll see that the friendly letters to McDonald stopped about 9 months after the verdict. Work on Fatal Vision continued for 3 years after that, with McDonald's lawyer aware, with McDonald aware, with many friends of his aware that I was not on the team. I was not writing a book that was going to exonerate him. And never at any time, I should say, did I ever tell him explicitly, this book that I'm writing is going to portray you as innocent. That, I think, would have perhaps been unethical.
You never told him that even during the time, let's say, up to 9 months after the verdict, when you more or less felt favorably toward him?
Never. I never said anything about what the book would ultimately say.
Now, once you had reached that decision, there wasn't this kind of close contact and this hanging around kind of stuff? And
not at all. There's an absolute lack of it, to the point where he would write letters complaining. Whatever happened, Joe? I thought we were such good friends, you know? And I would just look at these letters and say, I don't know how to answer this, so I'm just not going to. There is a record here that's very clear. This is why the Malcolm pieces are so deeply, badly flawed, and why I think it's so so suggestive of the fact that she was probably up to something else. You know, she was involved in her own litigation with Jeffrey Mason, this psychoanalyst.
Yeah, that's what I alluded to before. Let me just try to do this quickly. This is a tremendous irony. The psychoanalyst Jeffrey Mason, and these are names probably not well known to most of our audience, but in any case, Janet Malcolm, the writer for The New Yorker, he contends that that she not only fabricated quotes from conversations, literally fabricated, not just misquoted, that's his contention, but that she led him to believe that it would be a certain kind of piece, and then she portrayed him as a monster, an egomaniac, a deeply troubled man.
Essentially, with the added element of the fabricated quotations, essentially what she would have alleged that, or what McDonald alleged that I did to him. Her case, at the time she approached me about cooperating with her for the articles she wanted to write for the New Yorker, her case had just been dismissed on summary judgment. She thought she was free and clear. That turned out not to be the case. Just this past spring, the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, unanimous decision, I think it's the last unanimous opinion Thurgood Marshall joined in before he retired, overturned lower courts and have ordered her to trial. So now the question of her fabricating defamatory quotations can be decided before a jury. Added irony, that's a trial that I'm currently under contract to cover for Vanity Fair magazine. So we'll have...
and it's viewed potentially as an important First Amendment case, too.
Well, it's the appeal is an important First Amendment case. If her position and the New Yorker magazine's position that they argued before the Supreme Court, if that had been upheld, we all would have had a license to do anything we wanted to. They were saying it's okay to make up defamatory quotations. There are no limits. Even if she did this, it's perfectly okay because these things happen. Even if she did it deliberately, we're not talking about an accident here. The Supreme Court rejected that argument completely. So now it's going to be, we're going to have a trial out there in California to determine what the facts of her particular case are. When she came to me to talk to me about writing about me, she did not, I was aware of the fact that she had been sued by Mason. I was aware of the fact that his case, she had just prevailed, at least temporarily, in that case. And I thought, gee, this would be somebody who, having just been through kind of a bruising legal experience of her own, would probably be sensitive to some of what I had just been through that whole summer of 1987. In fact, I was blundering on stage, I think, at a particularly critical moment in her own personal psychodrama, and I had no idea of the role that she was going to cast me in.
Thanks. Good to see you again.
All right, Bob, my pleasure. Thank you.
We're on our way out of here. See you later.